Hello, my name is Grace. After my husband's funeral, my own mother drove me to a trailer park and said, "This is where you belong." She locked me out of my childhood room, froze my bank account, even sold my father's wedding ring. But the worst part? It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the silence, the whispers in town, the forged papers, the plan to erase me completely. What would you do if the very people who should protect you decided you didn't exist? The church bells had already tolled twice when I walked up the worn stone steps, the air thick with the scent of lilies and damp earth. My name is Grace, and this was the day I buried my father. In a small town like ours, everyone shows up for a funeral, not always out of love, but because absence would be noticed. Ohio mornings can be sharp in the fall, and that morning cut colder than most, not because of the air, but because of what was waiting inside. As I pushed open the heavy wooden door, the murmurs fell to a hush. Familiar faces filled the pews. Neighbors, family friends, the people who had known me since childhood. They offered me nods of sympathy, a few whispers of, "I'm so sorry," yet I felt the weight of eyes that didn't quite meet mine. Funerals bring out the truth of a family, I remembered hearing once. That thought stuck in me like a thorn as I made my way down the aisle. I expected to sit near the front, close to my father's casket. Instead, my sister and brothers were already settled there, shoulders straight, expressions composed like they were posing for a photograph. My mother sat rigid beside them, her hand gripping the prayer book as if it were a weapon. The row looked full, yet when I glanced carefully, I saw it, a single empty chair, left open near the casket. No one gestured for me to take it, not a glance, not a word. I hesitated, clutching my purse tighter, then someone behind me cleared their throat, and I realized I was blocking the way. So I slid into a seat near the back, next to the door, far from where I belonged. From that distance, my father's face seemed blurred, his casket almost out of reach. The sting cut deep. Even in his final moments, it felt like I was being kept at arm's length. Even here, I thought bitterly, I am the one left standing outside. The whispers around me returned, soft condolences mixing with speculation, the kind of half-words people share when they think you're too far to hear. I kept my eyes fixed on the front row. That empty chair mocked me. It wasn't just a seat. It was a statement. It told me clearly where my place was, or rather wasn't. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to breathe evenly, not giving anyone the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. The service droned on, hymns rising and falling. My brothers bowed their heads at all the right moments. My sister dabbed delicately at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. My mother never once looked back. When the pastor invited anyone to share a few words, silence hung thick until my legs moved almost on their own. I rose, steadying myself against the pew. I stepped into the aisle, heart pounding, and turned toward the altar. "My father," I began, voice trembling but clear enough. "He taught me that integrity wasn't about what you said, but about what you did. He worked these fields until his hands cracked, and he—" "That's enough, Grace." My mother's voice cut sharp, slicing through the air like glass shattering. Every head in the church snapped toward us. "Sit down." For a moment, the world froze. My mouth went dry, my words dangling unfinished. I stood there, heat rushing to my face as silence thickened around me. The pastor shifted uncomfortably, my sister avoided my gaze, and my brothers studied the floor. No one moved to defend me. I sank back into my seat, hands trembling in my lap. The silence after her interruption screamed louder than any accusation. I caught the pitying glances of a few neighbors, their lips pressed tight, but none dared speak. In that moment, I realized my erasure wasn't subtle anymore. It was public. "The family is supposed to be your shelter, not the storm," an old American proverb echoed in my mind, but here I was, drenched in the downpour of my own kin. I tried to steady my breathing, eyes fixed forward, refusing to cry. I reminded myself, silence can hold power if wielded well. They thought they had silenced me, but I was only waiting, learning. Memories flickered through me. Being the youngest, always brushed aside at dinner conversations, my accomplishments overlooked while my siblings basked in praise. My father had been my quiet anchor, the one who saw me, who slipped notes of encouragement in my books, who told me I had more grit than I realized. Now he was gone, and the others seemed determined to bury not just him, but my place beside him. I clenched my fists in my lap, then forced them open again, hiding the motion beneath my skirt. They think silence is weakness, I told myself. They don't see that silence can be strategy. I would not break here. Not today. The service ended, the final hymn lingering in the air as the pastor closed his Bible. People rose slowly, filing out row by row. I stayed seated, waiting until the aisle cleared. The church bell tolled again, deep and somber, vibrating through the wooden beams overhead. When the crowd had thinned, I walked to the front. My mother and siblings were already speaking to the pastor, their backs turned, their voices hushed. I stopped at the casket, resting my hand lightly on its polished wood. "Dad," I whispered, my throat tightening, "I will not be erased." The bell tolled once more as I stepped back, its echo carrying a promise I intended to keep. The morning after the funeral arrived heavy, like the house itself had absorbed grief into its walls. I woke in the room that had once been mine, the air still thick with the smell of funeral flowers that had been brought over after the service. Their fragrance wasn't comforting, it was suffocating, a reminder that what had been said yesterday could never be unsaid. I slipped on a simple dress, the same one I had worn too many Sundays to count, and made my way downstairs. The kitchen felt foreign. My mother and sister were already there, sitting stiffly at the table as if preparing for a business meeting, not mourning a husband and father. Their clothes were crisp, expensive-looking, ironed to perfection. My mother wore pearls that glistened against her dark blouse, and my sister had styled her hair in careful waves, the kind you see in glossy magazines. I glanced down at myself, plain cotton, sleeves a little worn from washing. My hands still smelled faintly of orchard soil, the kind of smell my father had carried with him all his life. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. They smelled like ambition and perfume. I smelled like the work we had built together. They barely looked at me. My sister tapped at her phone while my mother stirred her imported tea. Neither asked how I'd slept, neither mentioned Dad's name. Grief looks different in every household, people say. But money always comes dressed in a suit. Staring at them now, I couldn't help but think how true that was. I tried to fill the silence with a small gesture. Moving toward the counter, I opened the old tin of coffee grounds, the same brand Dad swore by. He used to say, "Why fix what isn't broken?" I scooped the dark powder into the filter, the smell rising familiar, grounding. The machine hissed and burbled, filling the room with a scent that reminded me of mornings before orchard work when he and I would sit together over steaming mugs before heading out. My sister wrinkled her nose. "That stuff smells burnt," she muttered, sliding her sleek French press across the counter. She poured hot water over her imported blend, filling the room with an aroma that screamed trend rather than tradition. "It's not burnt," I said evenly. "It's the way Dad liked it." She raised a brow, dismissing me with a smirk. "Old-fashioned doesn't mean good." I poured a cup and reached for my father's mug, the one with a chipped rim he'd used for years. Placing it gently on the table, I pushed it slightly toward where he used to sit. It was my way of honoring him, just for a moment. My mother's hand darted out. She grabbed the mug, sniffed the coffee with disdain, then carried it to the sink. Without hesitation, she poured the steaming liquid down the drain. The sound was louder than it should have been, like a deliberate erasure. "Mom!" I exclaimed, rising slightly from my chair. She turned back, her expression cold, controlled. "We're not clinging to the past, Grace. Things have to change." The room went still. My heart ached, but I forced myself to stay quiet. An American saying echoed in my head. Throwing out someone's coffee is like throwing out their memory. They had tossed out not just a drink, but my father's presence. I swallowed hard, reminding myself that silence can cut sharper than words. Later that morning, when the house had settled into its tense quiet, a knock sounded at the door. I opened it to find Mr. Reynolds, our neighbor, holding the local newspaper. His eyes were kind, but his voice uneasy. "Grace, I thought you should see this. Didn't want you to find out by accident." I thanked him and unfolded the paper. My eyes moved quickly down the page to the obituary section. There was Dad's name, his birth and death dates, a list of his surviving family. I read it twice, 3 times, my pulse racing. My name wasn't there. It wasn't a typo. My brothers were listed, my sister too, even distant cousins made the cut. But not me, not his youngest daughter. The sting hit harder than any slap. Yesterday, I had been silenced at his funeral. Today, I had been erased in black and white print for the entire town to read. To anyone scanning those lines, it was as if I had never existed. I gripped the paper until it crumpled in my hands. They didn't just push me aside yesterday, I thought, my chest tight. They erased me today. Neighbors who had seen the notice would believe I hadn't been part of the family at all. My contributions, my memories, my place, it had all been rewritten in a single column. This wasn't grief. This was execution, quietly carried out with ink and silence. I excused myself and retreated upstairs, holding the clipping like a weapon that had already cut me. In my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the words that excluded me. If they could strike my name from the obituary, what else could they strike? My father's will, my memories, my rights? I thought back to the countless little exclusions of my childhood, family photos where I was asked to step aside, dinners where my efforts were ignored while others were praised. I had been invisible long before this, but now they were writing my absence into history. I clenched my jaw, the paper trembling in my hands. They want me gone, I whispered to myself, but I won't go quietly. Being the youngest often meant being overlooked. In families like ours, traditional, rigid, the older ones were the golden children, the ones who mattered. The youngest, often the invisible one. But invisibility can be a weapon if wielded right. They thought they had stripped me of power, but they didn't realize erasure only sharpens resolve. I rose, tucked the clipping into my journal, and smoothed my dress. My reflection in the mirror looked tired, but behind my eyes burned something new: determination. Walking downstairs again, I slowed when I heard voices from the kitchen. My mother and sister sat close, their words low but sharp. I lingered at the doorway, the floorboard cool beneath my bare feet. "She doesn't belong here anymore," my mother said, her voice cold, final. My sister murmured agreement, her tone soft but deadly. "It's better this way." I froze, the words confirming everything I had sensed, but hadn't yet heard out loud. My heart thudded in my chest, but instead of breaking, it steadied. They had declared me an outsider in my own home, and I knew then, they hadn't just underestimated me, they had ignited me. The morning felt heavier than the night before. The house was too quiet, save for the faint creaks of the old farmhouse settling under its own weight. I tried to focus on the simplest tasks, folding my dress, brushing my hair, but I couldn't ignore what I had overheard. My mother's voice still rang in my ears. "Grace doesn't belong here anymore." Those words weren't whispered in the heat of grief. They were cold, deliberate, final. When I stepped into the kitchen, my mother was already by the door, her coat buttoned, purse in hand. My sister stood beside her, tapping impatiently on her phone. "We're going for a drive," my mother announced, not looking at me. "A drive?" I asked, wary. "Yes, you'll come with us," she replied. Her tone didn't leave space for refusal. The three of us piled into the car, my mother behind the wheel, my sister in the passenger seat, and me in the back. I tried to start a conversation, mentioning the orchard, Dad's tools that still needed sorting, but my words fell flat. Neither of them responded. They just stared ahead, the silence stretching thick. The farther we went, the more unease grew in my stomach. We passed fields my father had worked, rows of apple trees just beginning to yellow in the season. Usually we'd turn right toward town, but today my mother kept driving straight, then veered left, down a road I hadn't been on in years. I pressed a hand against the seat. "Where are we going?" No answer. The farmland gave way to cracked roads, then to rusted fences and scattered trailers with peeling paint. A few children played in the dirt, their toys broken, their laughter thin. I realized then where we were headed, and my chest tightened. Silence in a family car can speak louder than an argument, people say. And that silence told me everything. I wasn't being taken somewhere. I was being left. The car rolled to a stop at the edge of the trailer park. My mother killed the engine, her knuckles pale on the steering wheel. She finally turned, her eyes hard. "This is where you belong, Grace." The words hit me like a physical blow. For a moment, I couldn't move. I stared at her, trying to read any flicker of hesitation in her face, but there was none. My sister kept her gaze straight ahead, lips pressed in a thin line. Outside, a few neighbors glanced our way, curious. Children stopped playing, holding their toys against their chests, their eyes wide. I wanted to sink into the seat, to disappear, but I forced myself upright. In America, I remembered hearing once, your zip code can become your destiny. And here they were, writing my destiny in rusted fences and dirt roads. They weren't just placing me in a trailer park. They were burying me alive in plain sight. Before I could even gather my thoughts, my mother reached into the trunk and pulled out a suitcase. She shoved it toward me. "This is yours." I opened it slowly, hands trembling. Inside were a few faded clothes, worn shoes, and on top, a photograph of my father, torn right down the middle. His face was there, but the half where I had once stood beside him was missing. My throat burned. "You took everything out of my room, and this is what you left me?" My sister let out a quiet laugh, sharp and quick, before catching herself. She masked it with a sigh, adding, "It's just easier this way, Grace. You don't need all those things. No heirlooms, no savings, nothing of value. Just scraps." I stared down at the suitcase, the weight of it crushing me more than its contents. In every family, people say, there's the child who gets the feast, and the one who gets the leftovers. Now I knew exactly which one I was, but even as humiliation burned through me, something else rose beneath it. Anger, clear and sharp. They thought by stripping me bare, I had nothing left. What they didn't know was that silence isn't emptiness. Silence can hold more than words ever could. My mother pushed the suitcase closer. "Get out, Grace." For a moment, I didn't move. I wanted to shout, to demand why, but instead I stepped out, clutching the handle with white knuckles. The gravel crunched under my shoes as the door slammed shut behind me. I stood there in the dust, the wind tugging at my coat, watching as the car pulled away. They didn't look back. Not once. The trail of exhaust hung in the air like a final insult. I set the suitcase down, staring at the torn photograph inside. My father's half-smile looked back at me, the only reminder that I hadn't imagined his love. His voice came to me then, soft and steady as he used to be in the orchard. The oak fought the wind and was broken. The willow bent when it must and survived. I took a deep breath. "This isn't the end," I whispered to myself. This is the beginning. As the sun lowered behind the trailers, I planted my feet firmly in the dirt. They thought they had erased me, thought that by leaving me here, I would fade quietly. But I wasn't gone. I wasn't broken. "They think I'm gone," I whispered to the wind, my grip tightening on the suitcase. "They'll see me return stronger." I returned to the farmhouse later that week, clutching the hope that at least I could gather a few belongings of my own. The drive there felt long, every curve of the road pulling me deeper into a house that had stopped feeling like mine the day my father's casket was lowered. When I stepped inside, the air was different. It wasn't warm or heavy with grief. It was cold, clinical. My mother and sister moved about with a kind of choreographed efficiency, clearing papers from the table, speaking in hushed tones that stopped the second they noticed me. "Grace, we're busy," my mother said without looking up, her voice carrying the weight of a dismissal. I stood in the doorway, my eyes moving across the room. The walls, the kitchen counter, the very chairs, all of it had once been filled with Dad's presence. Now they looked stripped, sterilized, like the home was being scrubbed of anything that might remind anyone of him. "I just need to grab a few of my things," I said, trying to steady my voice. "Your things?" My sister gave a short laugh, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "We've already boxed up what you left behind. Check the basement." It was as though I had become a guest, tolerated at best. An American truth echoed in my mind. Sometimes the cruelest eviction doesn't need a sheriff. It comes from your own blood. I drew a breath, promising myself that I would take back at least a fragment of my childhood, something untouched by their bitterness. I climbed the stairs, each step creaking under my weight, leading me back to the room that had once been my refuge. I reached for the door handle, expecting the familiar squeak of the hinges. Instead, my hand met resistance. The knob wouldn't turn. A new lock glinted in the dim hallway light. I pressed against the door, my chest tightening. My own room, my sanctuary, had been sealed off from me. I rattled the knob, but it was useless. The sound echoed in the empty hall, sharp and humiliating. I leaned my forehead against the wood, remembering the walls lined with books Dad had given me, the quilt my grandmother stitched, the photographs taped by my mirror, all of it, locked away as though I had never belonged there. I forced myself to step back. When I went down to the basement, I found a small box shoved against a corner, half covered by old holiday decorations and rusted tools. Inside, my childhood had been reduced to scraps, a broken comb, a few clothes I hadn't worn in years, and trinkets that meant nothing. Not one picture, not one keepsake that had mattered. "They're not just pushing me out of the house," I whispered. "They're rewriting history, without me in it." The anger simmered, raw and sharp, but I bit it back. Tears would give them too much. I carried the box upstairs, only to see my mother and sister pretending not to notice me. Their silence was deliberate, heavy, like a curtain closing. The next morning, I made a decision. If they wouldn't give me the dignity of a place in the home, I'd at least claim my independence. With what little money I thought I had, I went to the local bank. The teller, a kind-eyed woman named Denise who had known my father, greeted me. "Grace, I'm so sorry for your loss," she said softly, taking my ID. "Thank you," I replied. "I need to check on the account my father set aside for me." Her fingers moved over the keyboard, her brow knitting almost immediately. She hesitated, then looked up. I'm not sure how to say this. The account is frozen." "Frozen? That can't be right." She lowered her voice. "Your mother filed papers. She claimed you're unfit to handle the funds. Something about stability, responsibility. It was all very official." The words knocked the air out of me. I gripped the counter to steady myself. My own mother had stolen my financial lifeline and justified it with lies. Denise gave me a sympathetic look. "I'm so sorry. Money doesn't change people, it just unmasks them." I swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "Thank you for telling me." Walking out of the bank, I felt the betrayal lodge itself deeper than any insult at the funeral, deeper than the locked door upstairs. This wasn't just about humiliation anymore. This was theft, calculated, deliberate theft. My father's gift to me, his promise of some independence, had been twisted into another weapon to control me. I walked the long road back, each step heavy but deliberate. The farmhouse loomed in the distance, not as a home, but as a fortress I was being kept from. I remembered my father's words about fairness. You can't wait for people to hand you what's yours. Sometimes you have to stand up and take it. I clenched the strap of the box I carried. "They think locking doors and freezing accounts will end me," I murmured. "They don't realize I don't break that easily." As I stepped onto the porch, I heard voices drifting from the kitchen window. I froze, listening. "If she contests anything," my sister whispered, her voice sharp, "we'll crush her. Dad trusted me, not her." The railing under my hand groaned as I tightened my grip, silent but burning inside. For the first time, I wasn't just humiliated. I was ready. The phone rang just after sunrise, its sharp sound slicing through the stillness of the trailer. I fumbled for the receiver, half expecting a wrong number. Instead, I heard the careful voice of Mr. Kessler, the banker who had managed my father's estate accounts. "Grace, I wouldn't normally call this early," he began, his tone measured, "but something came across my desk this morning that you need to know." My pulse quickened. What happened? There was an attempt to withdraw a significant portion of funds from the estate account tied to you. The paperwork looked official, but the signatures— He paused. "They bore your mother's name. It was blocked, but it's clear someone is maneuvering to cut you off." I sat in silence, my hand gripping the phone tighter. My suspicions were no longer shadows. They were fact. Be careful, Grace, he added, his voice dropping. These things don't happen by accident. Paper trails don't lie, people do. After we hung up, I sat staring at the wall, the weight of his warning sinking in. Fear mingled with vindication. Everything I felt in my bones these past days was real. My family wasn't just turning their backs, they were actively dismantling my existence. By mid-morning, I confronted them. My mother was in the parlor arranging papers, my sister lounging nearby, scrolling her phone with feigned indifference. I spoke to the bank, I said firmly. They told me someone tried to drain Dad's account, the one meant for me, and your name was on the forms. My mother didn't even flinch. She adjusted her glasses and replied coolly, You're too fragile to manage money. It's better this way. I'll take care of it. That money was Dad's gift to me, I snapped. My sister laughed softly, her tone laced with mockery. You should be grateful we're even thinking about your future. You wouldn't last a month without us managing things. Their arrogance seared into me. Every word was designed to strip me further of power, to force me into the role of the dependent child. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to breathe evenly. I nearly shouted, nearly let the anger burst out of me, but I bit down hard, holding it inside. They think silence is surrender. They don't see that silence can be preparation. I turned and walked away before they could see how much they'd rattled me. I wouldn't give them that satisfaction. That afternoon, while gathering my thoughts outside the trailer park, I spotted Hope Jane, our elderly neighbor. She was leaning on her cane, her weathered face kind yet serious. Grace? She called softly, motioning me closer. Your father asked me to hold something for you. He said, if things ever got messy, I'd know when to give it. From the pocket of her cardigan, she pulled a sealed envelope. My hands trembled as I took it. Inside, I found old deeds, handwritten notes, and documents hinting at assets in my name. My father's handwriting filled the pages, steady and deliberate. It wasn't just paper. It was his voice speaking across time, leaving me what protection he could. Hope Jane touched my arm gently. Your father trusted you. He knew the others might try to take more than their share. He wanted you prepared. I nodded, my throat tight. For the first time since the funeral, I felt a glimmer of hope. Sometimes the smallest piece of paper can outweigh the loudest voice, I thought, clutching the documents to my chest. That night, back in my trailer, I sat with the lamp casting a circle of light over my father's words. Trust in silence. But keep your proof safe. His sentence was underlined twice. I could almost hear his voice saying it. I tucked the documents carefully into a box and slid it beneath my bed. They had underestimated me. They thought they could bury me with locked doors and frozen accounts. But I had his proof now, and proof changes everything. I whispered into the quiet of the night. They'll regret underestimating me. The trailer park lights flickered outside, fragile but steady, just like me, ready to burn brighter when the time was right. I sat at the small table in my trailer, the lamp casting a yellow glow on the envelope Hope Jane had given me. My fingers traced the flap as if it were alive, pulsing with secrets. I hesitated, afraid of what I might find, and yet more afraid of what it would mean if there was nothing inside. Taking a steadying breath, I tore it open. Inside were pages folded carefully, protected as if they were treasure. The first sheet was a deed with my name scrawled in my father's handwriting. Not a copy, not a draft, an original. His signature, slightly shaky but clear, sealed it. Beneath it, notes in his hand, instructions, reminders, even fingerprints smudged in the corner from where he had pressed the pen too firmly. I pressed the paper against the table, tears burning my eyes. He had thought of me, planned for me, anticipated the storm I was now living through. The room spun with equal parts relief and grief. A saying I'd once heard came back to me. A signature is more than ink. It's trust in writing. This was his trust, his way of making sure I had a future even when others tried to strip it from me. I stayed there for hours, reading each line, tracing the words with my fingertips, clutching them like lifelines. I wasn't imagining it. My father had prepared for their betrayal, and now, in my hands, I had something real. The next day, I took the deed to the county office. The building smelled of old paper and dust, shelves stacked high with records older than I was. I asked for Mr. Hanley, the clerk who had known my father since boyhood. He adjusted his glasses and gave me a curious look when I slid the document across his desk. "Where did you get this?" he asked softly. "My father left it with someone he trusted," I said. "I need to know if it's valid." He leaned back, reading each line with slow care. Then he nodded. "This is real. And more than that, it predates any other claims. If your mother or sister filed something later, this still stands." My breath caught. "So, legally, this protects me?" "Yes. But Grace," he leaned forward, lowering his voice, "be careful. If they know you have this, they'll do anything to get it out of your hands." I clutched the deed to my chest, my stomach tightening. Empowerment mingled with fear. I finally had a weapon, but holding it meant painting a target on my back. Walking home, I thought of an old line. "The pen is mightier than the sword, but only if you keep it safe." I couldn't let them see what I had. Not yet. Timing would matter more than fury. That night, I returned to the farmhouse under the excuse of collecting more belongings. The house was quiet. Shadows stretched long in the hallways. I crept upstairs, careful not to make the floorboards creak. That's when I heard it, voices seeping through the crack of a half-closed door. I froze, then pulled out the old phone I still carried, its recorder scratched but functional. Pressing record, I edged closer. My mother's voice, sharp and cold, cut through the silence. "If she ever contests it, we'll use the forged copy. She'll never win." My heart pounded so loud I feared they would hear it. Then my sister's reply. "Dad never meant for her to get anything. We'll bury her memory too." The words twisted in me like knives. I kept the recorder steady, forcing myself to stay silent, every instinct screaming to burst through the door. But I didn't. I let them speak, their own voices condemning them more deeply than I ever could. When the conversation died down, I slipped away, phone clenched tight. Outside, the night air hit my face like ice. Rage churned inside me, but it wasn't wild. It was focused, sharp, controlled. I now had undeniable proof, not just of their cruelty, but of their conspiracy. Back in my trailer, I spread the documents and my phone on the table, staring at them as though they were weapons forged for me alone. "They think I'm powerless," I whispered. "They don't see the storm I'm gathering." I copied the recording, saved it twice, hiding it in places only I knew. The deed went into the box under my bed, locked tight. I knew now that I couldn't confront them yet. Timing was everything. If I struck too soon, they would twist the truth. But if I waited, if I let them continue believing I was broken, their arrogance would be their undoing. "Never interrupt your enemy when they're making a mistake," I reminded myself, recalling Napoleon's words. My silence wasn't defeat, it was strategy. I stood by the trailer's window, the night stretching dark and still around me. My hand tightened around the phone, the recording safe inside. "This is my shield," I whispered to the darkness, "and soon, it will be my sword." The call came just as the sun was beginning to dip, casting long orange streaks across the trailer walls. My sister's voice was unusually warm, coated with a sweetness that set every nerve in me on edge. "Grace," she said, almost tender, "Mom and I thought it would be good for us to sit down together, talk things through, maybe put all this unpleasantness behind us. Why don't you come to the farmhouse tonight?" I held the phone tighter, listening for the cracks beneath her words. She hadn't spoken to me like this in years, not even at the funeral. When someone suddenly gets nice after treating you poorly, it's not kindness, it's strategy. I knew it. Still, I agreed. "All right," I told her, my voice even. "I'll come." As I drove the familiar road, my chest tightened. The farmhouse came into view, but it didn't look like the home I had grown up in. It looked hostile, a place that once held sanctuary, but now held calculation. Every step toward that porch was measured, cautious. And inside, the kitchen lights glowed too bright. My mother and sister sat at the table, their smiles rehearsed. "Grace, my mother said, gesturing toward a chair. "We're glad you came." I sat down, folding my hands in my lap. The air was thick, staged, every gesture too careful. My sister slid a folder across the table. "We thought it might ease your mind," she said softly. I opened it. Legal papers stared back at me, pages filled with clauses and signatures. The words hit hard. I was being asked to sign away my rights. "It's for your own good," my mother added quickly. "We'll take care of everything. You won't have to worry about bills or decisions." "Exactly," my sister chimed in, nodding eagerly. "You'll finally have peace. No more stress, no more embarrassing mistakes." I looked at both of them, my face calm though my pulse pounded in my ears. "You want me to sign away what's mine," I said softly, "and call it protection." They shifted uncomfortably, but my sister snapped, her mask slipping. "You'll finally stop embarrassing us if you just sign." The words hung heavy. I closed the folder carefully, sliding it back across the table. "No," I said. "I won't sign." Silence stretched. My mother's jaw tightened, my sister's eyes flared. They wanted a reaction. Rage, tears, collapse. But I gave them none. I sat there quietly, memorizing every word, every gesture. They thought my silence was surrender. They didn't know it was strategy. As the meeting ended with cold stares, I rose from the table. On my way through the hallway, I noticed something missing on the shelf. My father's watch and his wedding ring. The small velvet box that had held them sat open and empty. My chest tightened. I turned back. "Where are Dad's things?" My mother didn't blink. "We sold them." "Bills don't pay themselves." "They weren't yours to sell," I whispered. My sister shrugged, her voice dripping with dismissal. "They were just things, Grace. Don't be so sentimental." Her words stung more than a slap. Those heirlooms weren't just things. They were pieces of my father, fragments of a life they were determined to erase. The cruelest theft is not of money, but of memory. And they had just stolen mine. I stepped outside before my fury cracked through. The cool night air wrapped around me as I leaned against the porch railing, the sound of crickets filling the silence they'd left behind. Every insult, every theft, they weren't breaking me. They were building my case. I remembered my father's words, spoken years ago in the orchard. The strongest tree isn't the one that resists the storm. It's the one that bends and survives. I breathed deeply, steadying myself. They thought I would lash out, thought I would collapse. Instead, I stored every betrayal, tucked it alongside the proof I carried with me. I wouldn't break. I would wait. As I walked away from the farmhouse, their voices carried faintly through the kitchen window. My sister's whisper was sharp, poisonous. "Don't worry, she'll break soon. She has nothing left." I smiled faintly in the dark, my hand brushing the pocket where my phone and their recorded confession rested. Word travels fast in a small town, faster than wind through the cornfields. Within days of the so-called family meeting, whispers began to stick to me like burrs. At the gas station, I caught two women staring at me over the candy racks. One leaned in and murmured, "She's just lazy, living off scraps." At the post office, a man I had known since high school muttered under his breath, "What a shame, turned into a leech." I didn't have to guess where the rumors came from. My mother and sister were spreading their version of the story, building themselves up as victims while painting me as weak, incompetent, useless. And in a town like ours, a whisper didn't need proof. It just needed repetition. A small town never needs proof, only a whisper. Every glance from neighbors felt like a nail driving in deeper. I walked down Main Street with my head high, but inside I burned. I could not fight gossip with words. It would only make me look defensive, desperate. So I swallowed the sting and reminded myself, I must act, not react. One morning, I stopped at the cafe on the corner, the one where Dad used to treat me to pie after long orchard days. I slid into a booth, ordered coffee, and tried to breathe. But behind me, the voices of three women carried clear. "Her father left her nothing," one said, stirring her tea with satisfaction. "Because she was useless." Another snickered. "Exactly. She couldn't run that orchard if her life depended on it. Everyone knows she was just dead weight. Their words pierced deeper than they realized, but instead of slinking away, I stood and walked calmly to their table. Their forks froze midair. You know, I began evenly, the truth doesn't need a defense. It just needs time and lies. Well, they reveal themselves faster than you think. The cafe went silent, their faces reddened, eyes darting to the counter, to the floor, anywhere but me. I didn't shout. I didn't curse. I simply held their gaze until the weight of their own words made them shrink back. Then I returned to my seat, finished my coffee, and left without another glance. Outside, the crisp air filled my lungs, and I realized something. Whispers may bruise, but silence, when carried with strength, cuts sharper. Still, I knew whispers weren't enough to destroy me. Only legal force could. That afternoon, I decided to visit Panasonic, my father's lawyer. His office sat on Main Street, an old brick building with paint peeling from the trim. Inside, it smelled of leather and old books. Stacks of files leaned against the walls, and the air carried the kind of gravity that came from decades of trusted work. "Grace," he said when I entered, rising from behind his desk. He was older now, stooped but sharp-eyed. "I was wondering when you'd come." I placed the envelope and deed on his desk. "I need to know if this is real, if it means anything." He adjusted his glasses, reading line by line. And when he finished, he looked at me with something like relief. "Your father anticipated this. He left safeguards for you. This deed, in your name, it's binding, legally sound. It predates any papers they might produce." The words washed over me like water after a drought. "So, I'm not powerless?" "Not powerless," he said firmly. "But you must be careful. Justice moves slow, but it moves. You need to be ready for the storm that will come when they realize you hold this." For the first time since the funeral, I felt a flicker of peace. I wasn't alone. Someone else knew the truth. Someone else could back me. When I left his office, the sun was sinking low, spilling gold across the street. My sister's car pulled up across from me, her window rolling down just enough for her cold stare to cut across the pavement. She didn't say a word, but her eyes asked the question, "What are you hiding?" I clutched my purse tightly, the deed safe inside, and whispered so only I could hear, "You'll know soon enough." The call from Panasonic came just before noon, his voice tight, urgent. "Grace," he said, "they're at the developer's office right now. Your mother and sister. They're trying to close the deal. If they succeed, the orchard will be gone by tomorrow." I froze, the receiver slick in my hand. This was it, the moment I had dreaded and prepared for. My father's orchard, his life's work, was hanging by a thread. The papers he left me, the deed in my name, the recording on my phone, all of it meant nothing if I didn't act now. "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere," Martin Luther King Jr. had once said. And standing there, I understood it like never before. This wasn't just about my inheritance. It was about truth, about legacy, about not letting lies become law. I pulled on my coat, my hands trembling, but my resolve firm. This was no longer a waiting game. It was time to strike. I laid everything I had on the table. The original deed, my father's handwritten notes, the recorded confession on my phone. I slipped them into my worn handbag, the same one I'd carried for years. It didn't look like much, but it held more power than my mother or sister could imagine. As I walked into town, the world felt both heavier and sharper. My knees threatened to shake, but I remembered my father's quiet wisdom. Stand tall, even if your knees shake. Each step echoed that command. Main Street bustled with its usual rhythm, farmers picking up supplies, shopkeepers chatting on the sidewalks. But for me, the world had narrowed to one building, the developer's office, its glass doors gleaming like a barrier. Inside, I could already picture them, my mother's stern authority, my sister's smug confidence, selling a legacy that wasn't theirs to sell. In a small town, reputation is currency, and they had been bankrupting mine to fund their scheme. But now I had something stronger than words. I had proof. I tightened my grip on the handbag and pushed the door open. The room was just as I imagined. Long, polished table, developers in dark suits, lawyers flipping through thick binders, and at the head of the table, my mother and sister, smiling like they had already won. The air shifted the moment I stepped inside. Conversations died mid-sentence. Heads turned. My sister's smile faltered into a sneer. "What are you doing here?" she snapped, her voice slicing through the room. "This doesn't concern you." I walked forward, my steps slow but steady. "It concerns me more than anyone," I said calmly, my voice carrying across the table. Their faces hardened, but the developers leaned back, intrigued. My presence alone had disrupted the stage they had so carefully set. Symbolism wasn't lost on me. My body in that room dismantled their attempt to erase my existence. I pulled out a chair, sat down, and placed my handbag on the table without opening it. Silence thickened, each second stretching longer than the last. My mother broke it first, her tone icy. "You have nothing, Grace. You always had nothing." I met her gaze steadily, my heartbeat loud, but my voice even. Inside, my thoughts burned. They mistake my silence for weakness. They'll soon see its strength. I let them keep talking, their arrogance spilling into the room. Every word they said only built the case I was about to unleash. Finally, I unzipped the handbag. Slowly, deliberately, I pulled out the deed, the notes, the phone. I laid them gently on the table. "You wanted me erased," I said, my voice steady. "Instead, I'm about to rewrite the story." The room froze. Faces blanched. For the first time, the power in the room shifted. Not to my mother, not to my sister, but to me. The room froze as my handbag landed on the polished table. I could hear the hum of the overhead lights, the tick of the wall clock, even the shuffle of a shoe from one of the developers. But no one dared speak. My mother leaned back in her chair with a scoff, her voice cutting the silence. "She's bluffing. She has nothing," she declared, her chin lifted with the same authority she had used all her life to silence me. The developer's lawyer studied me with cool eyes, his hands folded neatly in front of him. He wasn't convinced yet, but he wasn't dismissing me either. The entire room seemed to lean forward, waiting to see whether I'd crumble under the pressure. I steadied my breathing, remembering my father's words. "The truth may walk slowly, but it never loses its way." I let the weight of the silence build, watching their confidence wobble ever so slightly. The clock ticked louder in my ears, all eyes fixed on me. I knew this was my moment, one chance to cut through the lies. Finally, with calm precision, I reached into the bag. I pulled out the original deed. My father's signature stretched across the bottom in ink that carried his presence even from the grave. Gasps rippled through the room. The developers leaned forward, their lawyer immediately sliding the document toward himself to scan it. "This deed," he said, his tone tightening, "was verified by the county clerk." He looked at my mother and sister. "This contradicts the will you presented." My mother's face flushed red. "That's not valid!" she shouted, her voice shrill with desperation. "It's a forgery! She made it up!" But no one was listening to her. The lawyer flipped the pages, nodding slowly. "This is dated earlier. It predates your paperwork. Legally, this changes everything." The developers exchanged glances, whispers passing between them. One muttered, "In America, property is power. And power must be earned, not stolen." My sister tried to recover, her voice trembling but sharp. "She doesn't understand what she's holding. She's confused, manipulated." I cut her off, my tone steady, even. "No, I understand perfectly." The room simmered with tension, the first mic drop complete. But I wasn't finished. Slowly, I placed my phone on the table, my fingers deliberate. Without a word, I pressed play. The recording filled the room. My mother's voice, cold and cutting. "If she ever contests it, we'll use the forged copy. She'll never win." Then my sisters, sneering. "Dad never meant for her to get anything. We'll bury her memory too." The effect was immediate. Silence blanketed the room, thicker than before. But this time, it was suffocating for them, not me. The developers' faces darkened with anger, some shaking their heads in disbelief. The lawyer slammed the file shut. "This deal is suspended indefinitely," he declared. His voice carried finality, the kind that ends negotiations and careers alike. My mother's lips parted, her eyes darting frantically. "Wait, this isn't what it sounds like. We were misquoted, taken out of context." My sister reached for the developers desperately. "Please, you don't understand. She's twisting everything." But it was too late. Their own voices had condemned them. The representatives pushed back their chairs, one standing and fixing my family with a look of disgust. "We don't do business with fraud." My sister's composure cracked. Tears streamed down her face as she turned on my mother. "This is your fault! You ruined everything!" My mother stammered, her hands shaking as she tried to gather papers that no longer mattered. Their collapse was pitiful, loud, a sharp contrast to the silence I maintained. I sat still, watching, my calm presence a mirror of the control they thought they had stripped from me. Revenge didn't need shouting. Revenge didn't need spectacle. As the saying goes, revenge is best served cold and in silence. When the chaos subsided, I rose. I gathered the deed and the phone, slipping them back into my handbag. The room watched me, but no one dared stop me. I turned to my mother, meeting her eyes with quiet finality. "You wanted me erased," I said softly. "Instead, I erased your lies." The developers filed out, their polished shoes tapping against the floor, leaving my mother and sister in stunned silence. The boardroom that once echoed with their smug confidence now rang with their humiliation, and I walked out standing taller than I ever had before. News traveled faster than fire through dry grass. By the morning after the confrontation at the developer's office, the entire town knew. Whispers rushed from the cafe to the post office, from the grocery line to the church steps. My mother and sister had tried to sell the orchard with forged papers, and they had been exposed in front of the very men they wanted to impress. I walked down Main Street that day, head held high. The looks I received were no longer tinged with pity, but with something else, quiet respect. A man I'd known since childhood tipped his hat to me. A woman who had once turned her eyes away when gossip circled me pressed a gentle hand on my arm and said, "Good for you, Grace." In a small town, reputation is your currency. Lose it, and you're bankrupt. My mother and sister, once so sure of their control, were finding out what that meant. Later that afternoon, I made my way back to the farmhouse. I didn't go to confront them. I simply needed to see for myself what collapse looked like. From the porch, I could hear my sister's voice, shrill and cracked, echoing through the walls. "You ruined us. You ruined me," she screamed at my mother. "You and your lies, your schemes, look at what you've done." I stepped just inside the doorway, staying in the shadows. My mother's voice tried to rise above the chaos, but the cracks in her armor showed. She shouted back, words tangled, her authority slipping from her grip. The farmhouse that had once echoed with Sunday dinners and the warmth of my father's laughter was now filled with accusations and blame. They hurled words like weapons, mother and daughter tearing at each other, desperate to shift the weight of disgrace. Some houses are not haunted by ghosts, I thought, but by the living who cannot let go. I stood silent, watching. Satisfaction flickered in me, but so did sorrow. This was still my family, despite everything. To see them unravel was both justice and tragedy. I didn't step in. I didn't need to. They were collapsing without my hand. In the days that followed, I didn't return to the farmhouse. I chose instead to stay in my modest trailer. It was small, yes, but it was mine. No one could lock me out. No one could erase me from its walls. I began teaching classes at the community center, gardening, composting, how to grow vegetables in small plots of land. People showed up. Teenagers curious to learn, retirees looking for new purpose, young families eager to feed themselves. I spoke with the soil still under my nails, showing them how to coax life from earth, how to sustain themselves with what little they had. And in those small acts, I found joy. Cooking dinner for myself in my little kitchen, walking to the market without fearing whispers, planting herbs in pots on my windowsill, each moment was independence. Strength, I realized, is not in what you inherit. It's in what you build when no one helps you. I no longer cared for the trappings of the farmhouse. My father's orchard had been secured, its future untouchable by their greed. I had my proof, my deed, my recording. But more importantly, I had my life, and it was finally my own. One evening, sitting outside my trailer, I planted a sapling just by the porch. As I pressed the soil around its base, I thought of my father. Legacy isn't land or money, he had told me once. It's the truth you leave behind. The sapling was small, fragile, but it was mine. A legacy not of greed, but of resilience. I leaned back, letting the cool night air fill my lungs. For the first time in weeks, I felt peace. Not because the wound my family left had healed, but because it no longer controlled me. And then, a few days later, a letter arrived in the mail. I slid it open slowly, expecting a bill, maybe a note from a friend. Instead, I found the courthouse seal staring back at me. A formal notice of a hearing. My family's fraudulent actions had triggered legal consequences. I read the words twice, 3 times, my heart steadying with each pass. "It's not over," I whispered into the quiet trailer. "The law still has a say." The courthouse steps felt heavier than the orchard soil I had walked all my life. Weeks had passed since the confrontation with the developers, and though my mother and sister had tried to vanish into silence, the law had caught their trail. The notice I'd received was folded carefully in my purse, its weight both terrifying and liberating. I walked into the courtroom holding my father's documents and the phone with their voices sealed inside. My mother and sister were already seated, their postures small, their confidence stripped away. Once they had carried themselves like victors in waiting. Now they looked like defendants who already knew the verdict. The judge entered, a gavel tapping the air into order. Lawyers shuffled papers, the developer's attorney present to testify. When asked to present my side, I rose. My hands trembled slightly, but my voice did not. I laid the deed on the stand, pointed out my father's unmistakable signature, and explained the dates that predated the forged will. Then I pressed play on the phone, filling the chamber with their own words. "If she ever contests it, we'll use the forged copy. She'll never win." My mother's voice was sharp, confident, until it echoed off courtroom walls. "Dad never meant for her to get anything. We'll bury her memory, too." My sister's tone followed, dripping with contempt. Gasps rippled through the benches. The developer's attorney stood, voice firm. "We were nearly defrauded by this family. Her documents prevented it." The judge adjusted his glasses, nodding slowly. "The evidence is clear. The orchard deed stands. The attempts made against Grace Whitmore are fraudulent." He paused, his voice carrying weight that landed on everyone present. "The wheels of justice turn slowly, but grind exceedingly fine." Relief surged through me, strong enough to blur my vision. Vindication wasn't joy. It was heavier than that, but solid, undeniable. The humiliation of my family came swiftly. The courtroom was filled not only with officials, but with local press and familiar faces from town. The gossip that had once wounded me now turned like a blade against them. My mother tried to rise, her voice cracking. "This is a mistake. It was taken out of context." The judge silenced her with a gavel. My sister burst into tears, sobbing loudly, pointing at my mother. "It was her idea. She made me do it." The crowd murmured, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Symbolism struck me hard. Those same voices that had tried to erase me now became the hammer that crushed them. Their own words, their own schemes, had become their downfall. The court ruled fines against them and entered their fraud into record. Their reputation, once crafted carefully with social luncheons and business meetings, was shredded in a single morning. Small towns may forgive mistakes, but they do not forgive deceit. Accountability matters, even in bloodlines, especially in bloodlines. When my turn came again, I stood with the deed in hand, but instead of asking for the farmhouse, instead of clinging to what had been, I made a different choice. "I don't want the farmhouse," I said clearly, eyes moving across the room. "But I will ensure the orchard lives on. My father's work cannot end with lies." I handed over a document, a formal donation of the orchard's water rights to a local agricultural trust. Gasps rose again. But this time they weren't in shock. They were in awe. "This land will not be leveled for profit," I said. "It will remain soil for farmers, a place to grow, a legacy for the community. Legacy is not greed. It's what we leave to those who come after us." The courtroom grew still. Then applause spread. Quiet, respectful, genuine. Judges don't see clapping often, but no one stopped it. It wasn't for me alone. It was for the orchard, for truth, for what justice can look like when it is finally done. Weeks later, back at my trailer, I planted another tree outside my porch. It was small, its roots delicate, but I pressed the soil firm around it with steady hands. Renewal didn't need to be grand. It needed to be real. I no longer longed for recognition from my family. I had my father's truth, and I had my own strength. That was enough. I began holding regular gardening workshops, passing on what he had taught me: how to tend soil, how to listen to land. People came, not out of pity, but out of respect. We laughed, we learned, and for the first time, I felt a new family forming around me. One built of choice, not blood. Sometimes closure doesn't come from apologies. Sometimes you don't get closure from people. You get it by closing the door yourself. And I had closed that door. At sunset, I sat on the porch, watching the new sapling sway gently in the wind. I touched the rough wood of the chair and whispered, "This is where I belong, and no one will take that from me again."